screen. Can you hear me okay? Just a quick sound check before I start.
Yes.
Okay,
Yeah.
great. All right. So the presentation today, unusual sometimes in the field of conservation, is a good news story. I'm going to be talking about two very recent years where we had unbelievable numbers of wading birds. And it's when we had flows return to the Everglades, freshwater return to the Everglades through a number of reasons that I'll explain shortly, that we just got this incredible wading bird response, and that has and we were able to use that to really sort of fine tune our understanding of wading birds in the Everglades and really show that Everglades restoration can work if we can get the water right in the Everglades again. Okay, now let me just see which button I need to do to progress. Excuse me a second. For some reason, it's not progressing. I'm going to turn this off, see if that works. Let's do that. Still not progressing for some reason.
You're welcome to go back out and come in again on your PowerPoint.
Okay, let's.
And on ours, in the lower left, there's like a 1, 2, and if you hit it, it goes to the next. I don't know if you have that on this.
No, we don't.
No.
Okay, so let's go for more. All right. I want to leave the meeting, but let's try this one. Okay. So let's try that again. Oh, maybe try that again. There we go. I don't know what went wrong there, but now it's working, so that's good. Okay, so let's start again. Okay, so river of grass, when flows return to the river of grass. Now this is all based on science, but do not worry, it's not going to be particularly sciencey. I'm going to try to explain this as much as possible through sort of more visual means, through video and mainly through photography. There's a few figures that I will show, but nothing too technical. So don't worry about anything being too technical here. It's really a story about this wonderful year and what it means in terms of Everglades restoration. So, but to start the story, we need to sort of look back at the history a little bit of the Everglades and go back to a time prior to when humans drained it. So this figure on the right here is a representation of the Everglades in 1850, sorry, before we really did anything to the Everglades to drain it. And you can see there's a number of places, just to give you a reference. There's Lake Okeechobee here, West Palm Beach at the top here, which I can't see, is Stewart, and Miami and Florida Bay, and the Keys are down here at the bottom. And Marjorie Stoneman Douglas was absolutely correct when she called the Everglades the river of grass. So what happens in the wet season is you get these seasonal pulses of water. During the wet season, when it rains a lot, Lake Okeechobee would overflow its banks, and you'd literally get this river, this slow, very slow moving, almost 90-mile long, 60-mile wide river of grass, just slow moving water flowing south into what's called this area called the Ridge and Slough. And if we look up here on the left, we can see this picture of the Ridge and Slough. It's very well named. It's deeper water sloughs and higher elevation ridges. It's like a corrugated landscape. And this area, though, was not particularly that great for the birds, we think. It was largely a very deep habitat, stayed deep for most of the year, dried down during the dry season, the winter dry season, but probably never dried out and was probably only useful to wading birds towards the end of the dry season. But as we head further south, we come to much more important areas for the wading birds. And you can see we've got these these channels here, these sloughs. We've got Shark River Slough, that's the main slough with water running from Everglades National Park into the Gulf of Mexico and Florida Bay. Taylor Slough down here, a smaller slough, but really important for supplying fresh water to Florida Bay. Now, Florida Bay today is quite salty, but historically it was an estuary. It was a brackish water estuary, and it was that fresh mixture of fresh and seawater that gave it all its productivity historically. And then we've got this kind of well-named area called Lossman Slough that to some extent has been kind of forgotten and lost in terms of Everglades restoration. And this again supplies water, essential fresh water to these coastal wetlands at the bottom here, these mangrove coastal wetlands. And it's this area here, we call this the Fertile Crescent, because this historically is where all the birds used to nest. We literally have hundreds of thousands of nests of all the different wading bird species, primarily white ibis, but also wood-storks and all the herons and egrets and spoonbills, and all the wading bird species would nest primarily in this area called the Fertile Crescent. In fact, about 90%. We'd also have colonies down here on the coast, and this is mainly where everything was. And this watery landscape was literally this wonderful area of abundance and biodiversity. It wasn't just the wading birds, but we'd have huge populations of healthy populations of predators, such as crocodilians, such as American crocodiles and American alligators, literally millions of different types of water birds, including waterfowl, seabirds, and shorebirds. And shorebirds in particular, wintering shorebirds were found, probably in the millions at that time. And yes, even flamingos. We were talking flamingos a little bit earlier on. Recent research has shown that absolutely that these birds were native to South Florida. They would be found in the thousands, particularly during the winter months. And there is even some credible evidence that they nested here in South Florida prior to the drainage of the Everglades. But paradise found is often paradise lost, unfortunately. When us Western Europeans got our hands on the place, things changed dramatically. And this actual satellite image of South Florida is what the Everglades look like today. We've lost approximately half the original Everglades to urban and agricultural development here south of the lake. And what remains has been drained by hundreds of miles of canal and compartmentalized into these impounded areas, impounded by levees, these areas called the water conservation areas. And to cut a long story short with this, the problem is far less water is now flowing through the Central Everglades and down into this wonderful area that was so important for wading birds and other wildlife. What I didn't talk about earlier was these pink areas. These are what we call marl prairie areas. These are areas that they're higher elevation, and so these were important areas for providing food and foraging areas for the birds early in the breeding season, sort of November, December, January, when everything else was too wet to be able to forage in. But these areas are now, they barely get any water at all. We can barely even call them wetlands because they're so dry and there's no fish or productivity there for the birds to feed upon. And these coastal wetlands that are also important early foraging areas, again, they're too dry and largely too saline as well. The salt water is encroached. There's no fresh water flowing into them, so they become far too salty. And the consequence of that, obviously, is that it's had serious repercussions for the ecology of the Everglades. And affected most of all has been the wading birds. And in particular, the wading birds such as the storks and the ibis and the spoonbills that feed by touch. We call them tactile foraging species. These are the birds that really require very high densities of prey to be able to forage effectively. And so they've been most affected by the changes that have occurred with the hydrology, the water depths, how long water is available in the system, and those sorts of things. They're the ones that have been really affected. And so the wood stork and the ibis, for instance, have declined by 78 and 87% respectively from the 1940s to 2001. Although I'll show you this later, we have seen somewhat of an improvement since then. Not only that, but there's been a shift in the location of where these birds nest. I said a second ago that these birds historically nested in these coastal areas in the southeast coast of the Everglades National Park, but now most of the birds have moved either elsewhere. I was talking to Craig earlier, up into South Carolina even, but those that did stay in the Everglades moved to the water conservation areas, these impounded landscapes that the birds really can't forage in until later in the season. So they start nesting much later in these areas. They're not as successful, and their numbers are significantly lower than they were in these coastal colonies. And probably the most sad and poignant effect of all which I get to see nearly every year, and it's heartbreaking, is that the wood stork is nesting now much later than it did historically, and this is really affecting their nesting success. So if we just look at this top figure here, it basically shows the egg-laying date of these birds and how it used to start in the 1940s and 50s in November, December, and now you see this steady decline as we drain the Everglades, and now we're typically seeing that anywhere from January, February, March. And the consequence of that is that these birds, are now, they're failing to produce chicks. And so this figure at the bottom here shows the probability of fledging at least one nestling from a nest. And in the pre-drainage 1940s, 30s, 40s era, we would get, about a probability of almost 80% of a nest fledging. And nowadays it's down to about 20% or even less. And the reason for that is that these storks have a really long nesting period, about 4 months from egg laying to getting the chicks, independent of the nest. And so if they nest in November, December, even January, they can get their chicks fledged by March or April, before the summer rains come. But if they start nesting in February, March, they're not getting, the nestlings are still in the nest in May and June, when the rainy season starts, water levels rise, the shallow water conditions that they need to forage in effectively disappear, and the fish disperse throughout the landscape. And basically they lose their food supply, and the nestlings starve. And unfortunately, this is what I see nearly every year, but on a grand scale in the Everglades, is nests. You can see the nest here. What you can see in here is bones of the chicks, and here is a vulture feeding on a carcass of a dead chick. Now, I'm sorry to provide a graphic image here, but that is just the truth of what is happening in the Everglades on a regular basis. These birds get attracted to the Everglades still. We can produce good conditions for them earlier in the season, but they're just not nesting early enough for them to be able to produce their chicks. But having said all that, remember I said that this is a good news story that I wanted to say today. And in recent years, what's happened, we've had these these quite dramatic tropical weather events that have created conditions in the Everglades. They've actually produced records amount of rainfall. in particular areas right over the Everglades. And this, in combination with very recent restoration activities, such as creating bridges over Tamiami Trail, allowing more water to flow south, and other construction activities that have enabled more water to flow into Florida Bay, has enabled us to rehydrate these areas in the southern Everglades that are so important for wading birds and for the rest of the ecology. And so today I'm going to talk about the incredible ecological responses that have occurred from this, a little bit about what we've learned from it from a scientific perspective, and then what this ultimately means in terms of Everglades restoration. And so the rest of the presentation is going to basically follow this. I'm going to, first of all, just talk about wading birds, what the requirements are for wading birds to be successful in the Everglades and how well they've done in recent history and during these wonderful nesting years, and what that all means for restoration. And then the second part, depending on how much time I have left, I will go through a number of my photographs that I take when I'm doing surveys from the helicopter in the Everglades and show you some of the responses that we saw during these wonderful nesting years. So wading birds are, as you probably all know, the herons, the egrets, the storks, the spoonbills, and the ibises. And to make a living in the Everglades, to successfully forage and to have these large nesting events, these birds need shallow water with very high densities of aquatic prey animals, small fishes, crayfish, small amphibians, those sorts of things. And this relationship between the hydrologic conditions, these shallow water conditions, and their prey is really what drives wading bird nesting populations in the Everglades. They're not hunted anymore. The pollution is not an impact. They've still got plenty of good habitat. What we need to do is get the water right for these birds. We need the right amount at the right time and the right place. And if we can do that, then we can get enough food for them, and then we can restore their numbers of nesting birds. We can get them nesting back down in the coastal region again, and then we should be able to get these storks nesting early in the season again so they can be successful again. And it's because of this sort of tight relationship between the birds, the water, and the food that they are absolutely one of our key performance indicators for Everglades restoration. If we can get the water right for the birds and we can get them to do all the things that they used to do in terms of their nesting, then it's pretty likely that we've restored the system to something close to what it used to be. And that means that everything else, the rest of the ecology, the rest of the restoration, for the large part, should follow suit. So these birds are really good indicator species. And so we have 4 major indicator species for the mainland freshwater Everglades. There's another one, the roseate spoonbill, that we use for the keys of Florida Bay and the coastal region of Florida Bay. But for the freshwater Everglades, including those coastal regions and the crescent that I was talking about earlier, that area where they're all nesting, we use these 4 different indicator species. And we can break these into 2 different groups. There are the herons and egrets, which we call visual foragers. And so we have the snowy egret that basically chases its food. These are sight foragers. They both have these long S-curved, basically a slingshot neck with a spear on the end of it, and they use that to be able to see and capture their prey. These guys have not declined quite as much as the next 2, the tactile or touch foragers, the white ibis and the wood stork. As I mentioned earlier, these are the guys that to me are the most important birds to monitor in the Everglades. These are the ones that have declined the most and are most sensitive to changes in hydrologic condition. And so we have the white ibis. This is a bird, you know, they're still common, but they're nowhere near as common as they were historically. And they have such an important role to play because they were so abundant. Literally hundreds of thousands of these birds would be in the Everglades. So they have a huge impact on prey resources and also nutrient dynamics. Imagine a colony of 50,000 white ibis and the poop and the guano, the dead chicks, the empty eggshells, all that goes with it. That is a huge boost of nutrients to the local area. And if they're nesting in the mangroves, those mangroves are going to grow much faster, much bigger, and the soil level is going to rise much faster in these areas where these birds are nesting. And that can actually mitigate climate change with sea level rises. If you've got areas with mangroves that are rising at the same level as sea level rise, this can help even protect the southern Everglades from sea level rise. Now, our other guy is the woodstock. Again, a tactile forager. This guy feeds in the water column using its beak, and it has the fastest reaction time, 0.25 milliseconds, tactile response. So if a fish hits its beak, it can close in 0.25 milliseconds. That's faster than we can blink. But despite that, it still needs to be able to, you know, if it's just moving through the water column, big volumes of water it has to cover before it actually touches a fish. That's why it needs these high densities of prey to be able to feed on. The white ibis, on the other hand, that's a bottom feeder. It's feeding on crayfish, largely on the bottom, you know, in the sediments and on the bottom of the water. So, brief introduction to the birds that we're talking about. Now I want to show you some of the patterns, nesting patterns that we've seen over the last, you know, couple of 2 or 3 decades, and the responses that we've seen in recent years when we've had these really wet, excellent conditions for foraging. And so this is quite simple. It's simply the number of nests of our 4 indicator species, the white ibis, the woodstock, the great egret, and the snowy egret, over each year over the last 30 odd years or so, up until 2017. And we've also got the average of the last 19 years here. And there's a couple of things that I really wanted to point out here. First of all, we've seen a shift in the nesting populations, a long-term shift, going from very poor nesting in the 1970s, 80s, and 90s, with only about sort of between 5,000 and 10,000 birds in the entire Everglades on average each year. Very, very low numbers. But this all changed at the turn of the millennium, up to about, on average, about 30,000 nests, which is quite the jump. And we're not entirely sure exactly why this happened, but there was a number of things that happened around about this time. We saw a shift in the climate, the long, greater than decadal cycles of climate. We entered a slightly wetter cycle, so it created slightly wetter conditions, which are conducive to the birds. But I think probably more important is that we as scientists, we learned a lot more about the system by this time. We knew how to manage for these birds in a better way, starting at the turn of the millennium. And we also started to communicate much better with the water managers. So instead of the water managers dumping water here, there, or moving it there, sort of irrespective of its effect on the ecology, now we were conversing weekly and trying to do the best we can. There's obvious constraints like water supply and flood control and all those things. But if we can manage within that, we could also manage for the ecology. And that's what we did. And that has been improving consistently over this period of time. And so another thing to note is, though, during this improved period, we have years that are really good, years that are relatively poor, good again, poor again, good again, poor again. And, and that is a characteristic of wading birds. We don't need them to be nesting in really large numbers every year. They go through these boom bust cycles, great one year, poor the next. And that's what they did historically. We would have, instead of 60,000 nests one year and 20 the next, we would have 150,000 nests one year and 20,000 the next. But that's how they worked. And that's basically just a reflection of differences in hydrologic conditions and prey resources among years. And so we saw about 10 years of this kind of nice pattern that we were expecting to see, not the huge numbers we wanted, but certainly that we were going in the right direction. And then, and we even had a really good nesting year, 2009, 63,000 nests, which is, nothing to sneer at, a very good nesting year. But kind of since that time, everything dropped off and went a bit flat. We were getting these low numbers, but none of the high numbers. And, we thought, okay, well, something's going on here that wasn't particularly great. And then this happened. Hurricane Irma, the fall of 2017. So that's the wet season prior to the 2018 nesting season. And Hurricane Irma, hurricanes can be destructive, whatever, but from an ecological point of view, they can also be very beneficial. And, they deposited a huge amount of rainfall, record amounts of rainfall across the Everglades. And this, combined, like I said earlier, with some of the restoration activities, enabled us to send a lot more water to areas that have been dehydrated, overdrained, and we were able to rehydrate these areas. And the response. Okay, so one other thing is that we also had wonderful conditions, and I'll go into that later. We also had wonderful conditions subsequent to this, during the nesting season. We had a very nice dry season subsequent to Hurricane Irma. And that was also, we had perfect conditions for these birds. But we had never seen anything like this before. And this is the response that the birds gave us in 2018. The largest nesting event by far, 116,000 nests. The best nesting we've had in 80 years. Now, this is only for those 4 species, remember? So, in terms of total number of wading bird species, we were close to, I think, almost close to 130,000 nests in the Everglades in that year. Absolutely incredible. So, and this is almost 4 times the recent average, almost double the previous banner year of 2009. But most importantly, it was very similar to some of those wonderful nesting events we had in the 1930s and 40s, the pre-drainage Everglades. We had recovered wading birds at least for 1 year, which was pretty amazing. Okay, so subsequent to that, we had 2 drier years where, we thought, oh, we're just back to normal again. It's just a freak year. But in the fall of 2020, Tropical Storm Eta came right across the bay and deposited another deluge across the Everglades at very wet conditions. And again, it was what we call a La Nina year. So we had a very dry season, beautiful dry down, enabling the water to become shallow again. And the response here was 83,000 nests. Another wonderful year, not quite the same in terms of numbers of nests, although I'll talk about nesting success a bit later. So this was yet another wonderful nesting year. So not only did we have this one excellent year in 2018, but we're beginning to see those patterns again where we are having excellent nesting year, poor nesting year, excellent nesting year. This is almost like restoration before, we've really got going with restoration. And obviously it was helped by these tropical weather events. But this is really important because, one, it shows the resilience of the Everglades and wading birds and how quickly we can get them back again if we get the water right. And that means and this is really important, restoration will work if we provide more water to the Everglades. We've shown that it actually works by complete fluke because of weather conditions. But now when, our big bosses have to go up to Congress in Washington, D.C. and our politicians have to go to D.C. and beg the feds for, Everglades restoration money. We can show them graphs like this and say, look, we're no longer, this is no longer a hypothesis that we're going to do all this and Everglades restoration is going to work. We now know it's going to work. So, it just provides us an ability, a better selling point to get the funds we need for Everglades restoration. And it also, we were able to do some science at this point that enabled us to learn things that we haven't been able to learn in our overdrained Everglades landscape. And so we've learned a lot more that will also help us with Everglades restoration. Right, so that was the nesting response, the number of nests, but not only that, both of these years were highly successful in terms of the numbers of chicks that were produced and fledged successfully. So, I showed you those pictures of woodstocks earlier with, vultures picking off the bones, but this is what it looked like in 2021. Thousands and thousands of woodstock nests, each with 3 or 4 plump, healthy, large nestlings that fledged into wonderful conditions in the Everglades. We had some of the 2021, although we didn't quite have as many nests as in 2018, probably produced more chicks than we've ever produced in the last 80 years. And probably most interesting from my point of view, from a scientific point of view, is that the birds returned to some of those historical colonies on the coast, in that fertile crescent region in southeastern Everglades National Park. This is just one of those colonies, Cabbage Bay colonies, and what you're seeing here is mainly just all these woodstocks and great egret nests. You guys have probably been to some of these wonderful places, the alligator farm or Cotahatchee wetlands, places like that, where you see these nesting birds close up. But to see the birds in the numbers that we're seeing them in some of these colonies was just mind-blowing, just phenomenal to see. Okay, and I just want to show you the numbers here. So, the typical over the last 10 years prior to 2018 was about 4,000 nests in these coastal regions. In 2018, we had an order of magnitude more, 40,000 nests in 2018 and about 30,000 nests in this region in 2021. Okay, so the question is, why were these such good years? Yeah, we had more water and we can send more water south, but what actually is it that created these wonderful conditions? And so what I'm going to do now is quickly talk about what these birds need. We talked about prey availability, that these birds, the nesting of these birds is limited largely by the hydrologic conditions and how that affects their food resources, the fish and the crayfish and everything else. At a very basic level, this is very simple. We can make this much more complicated, but intuitively, it's quite simple. It's a 2-stage process. So in the wet season, prior to nesting, we want to see a very wet landscape. and it's obvious, right? Fish need water, crayfish need water. And most of the critters that these birds are feeding on don't have very long lives. They live for a year or two for the most part. So in the type of wetland that we have, a fluctuating wetland, where we have the wet season being wet and fills up with water, and the dry season where it dries down, and in some places, particularly in current times, it dries out completely. So what we want to see is very wet conditions, and the wetter the conditions, the longer the period of time that the fish have to grow and reproduce and grow large and reproduce again. And so the wonderful wet conditions that we had due to Hurricane Irma and Tropical Storm Eta flooded the entire Everglades. It created not only very deep conditions, but it flooded a much larger area than it does usually. And it also, those areas that are typically far too dry and overdrained became much wetter than they were usually. So we had all this food production across a much larger area. And also, because it's deeper, that water lasted for longer into the dry season. We call the amount of time that we have water in the Everglades the hydro period. And so the hydro periods were greatly extended, particularly in some of these drier areas. And so we had this massive production of fish across the Everglades. Now, of course, these wading birds cannot feed during these really deep 2 to 3, 4 foot deep conditions. And so that's why they nest in the dry season. And so the dry season, we need water levels to decline. And so those prey, all the fish can become available for those birds to feed upon. These birds are not great fishermen. Like I said earlier, they need these real high concentrations of fish to be able to feed effectively, particularly those species that feed by touch. And so this diagram here, it's for the ridge and slough, but basically the principle is the same across the Everglades. During the summer, during the end of the wet season, all of the landscape is flooded. It's too dry. It's too wet for the birds to feed in. But the water is spread across the landscape, and with the water spread across the landscape, so are the critters. They're all up in the ridges and the tree islands are all flooded, and the prey and the fish are all spread within these areas. But as the dry season progresses and the Everglades slowly dries out, the ridges and sloughs, ridges and tree islands dry out, the fish and crayfish are all moving down into these deeper water areas. And then eventually it gets to a stage where even the sloughs are beginning to dry out. And basically what's happening is the aerial coverage of water is shrinking, and the volume of water is shrinking as it gets shallower and shallower. And so all the fish are becoming more and more and more concentrated. And it's then that these birds can forage on them effectively. And here we can see, a vertical looking straight down into a slough in the Everglades with all these birds foraging in this, drying, basically a huge puddle full of prey. And that's what we saw in 2018 and 2021. We had these super wet conditions in both years in the wet season, and then this beautiful dry down during the dry season. Now, quite often, this year being one of them, we had really wet conditions. I was seeing flocks of birds 10, 20,000 strong, huge numbers in the early wet season. We were on for a wonderful nesting year. But this year is an El Nino an El Nino year. We had all that rain during the winter. We didn't get that nice dry down. And so we didn't have a good nesting year this year. And so you need both very wet season and a relatively dry season. And those are the perfect conditions for the birds. Okay, so that's kind of the reason why we had super wet conditions that we hadn't seen before and a beautiful dry down. But there were many unanswered questions. We'd never really seen the birds respond to conditions like this before. And so literally, while Tropical Storm Eta was over us, I'd seen the forecasts for the winter. I knew we were going to get these really wet conditions. I knew the forecast was for a very dry season, and it looked like 2021 was going to be another phenomenal nesting year. So I quickly organized a fairly simple study where I go out in a helicopter and I basically locate where the birds are foraging during these excellent conditions. Because previously we have not had birds foraging along the coast or in big cypress swamps or on those marl prairies, those higher elevation pink habitats that I was showing you on the satellite image. And we wanted to know whether these areas were really important for the birds. And I'm lucky with working for the water management district, and we have availability of the helicopter, but we also have some incredible data tools at our disposal. And so one of them is that this is a map of the Everglades, and we have stage gauges, water depth gauges throughout the Everglades that can be modeled. And knowing the surface elevation of the Everglades, we can actually model water depths across the Everglades. Now, we've also done a lot of research on the optimal depths that these birds forage at. So this is a depth suitability map for a single day in the Everglades based on all those gauges. And because we know the depths that the birds feed at, the optimal depths that they feed at, and depths that are too dry and too wet, we can actually, categorize these water depths according to how the birds will view whether, it's good or bad, or, too dry, too wet, or good for the birds. It's basically like a Goldilocks map for these birds. And so what we have here is the green areas is, where the porridge is just right for Goldilocks. This is where the birds will have optimal depths and also to some extent this light blue as well. The darker blues are far too deep, and the browns are too dry for them to forage at. And so, the Everglades is a map, it's thousands of square miles. Even in a helicopter, I cannot cover in a single day all areas where these birds might be foraging. But I can use these maps. I can get an up-to-date map just before I go to fly for that day, and I can basically see where all the green and light blue areas, and I can focus my surveys just on these areas. Now, the only problem that we faced is that this depth model doesn't cover the coastal regions. So at the beginning of the season, I basically just flew systematically across this area until it dried out. And so now I just basically want to show you just three very simple slides showing on the maps where these birds were foraging and why it was so important. So we're going to start off very early in the dry season. This is December the 1st. We can see that what I'm showing here is these are three of the major colonies. We've got a massive colony up in the north here, that's mainly ibis, and two of those historical coastal colonies. This one here is Cabbage Bay, the one I showed you a picture of earlier. Now, on December the 1st, pretty much all the Everglades was too deep. There's no point even flying over it and surveying it. And so I focused all my attention on the coastal region. We had governing board members and others complaining how deep it was. It was going to be terrible for the birds because it's too deep. But these coastal regions were just fantastic. You've got fresh water flowing into these estuarine areas where there's lots of nutrients. It just was productivity on steroids. And we had over 40,000 birds foraging in this region. This is what kickstarted basically early nesting for the wood-storks and other species such as the great egret and roseate spoonbill in this region, and basically was the foundation for these large nesting colonies in the coastal Everglades. But also, these wading birds, they're not just birds from the Everglades. These are birds that fly all over the southeastern United States. They are searching for areas, and the primary area they come to sort of at this time of year is the Everglades, because other areas are too cold and they're just really not suitable for nesting at this point. So the first place these birds come to is the Everglades. And if conditions are good here, they're going to stay. And that's exactly what they did. And on the right here, we can see, large foraging flocks of birds, as well as pelicans foraging in these mangrove regions in the coast. Okay, now we're going to jump a few more months ahead. This is the 5th of March, 2021. And this is about the time we start to see white ibis start nesting. So I was really interested to see where these birds were going to be foraging. Now, these birds, they eat crayfish, as I suggested earlier. They really like wet prairie habitats. They don't like these deep water sloughs. These prairie habitats, many of which have been overdrained in recent years, particularly in this area here. This is the marl prairies. These have been seriously overdrained, but when we add water back to them, and we got some prairie habitat up here as well, and prairie habitat in some of the Briggs cypress area as well, when we add water to these areas, it brings the crayfish back, and this is what we saw. Now, we're still seeing some birds foraging on the coast, but it's pretty dry. Most now have moved to these shorter hydroperiod habitats. And you can see all the green areas around here. And we had, 18, 19,000 birds foraging in this region, and another 12 to 13,000 foraging in this area here. Again, numbers we had never, ever seen before. And this was key. As this area dries down, this is what triggered these huge white ibis nesting colonies here in these coastal region. And this is just an aerial view of some of those white ibis flying over one of these marl prairie grassland habitat. They're basically just short grasses, about muley grasses and sparse sawgrass about a foot high, and just perfect conditions for crayfish. And we'll just go back, but note that this is the main, look at the sloughs. They're so deep still, very deep. There's no birds foraging in these areas at all. And it's not until, before we go on, let me just show you a quick video if it works. This is just a flock of these wading birds, these white ibis foraging in these prairie habitats. This is just one flock. I'd fly another quarter of a mile, and there would be another flock like this. Just huge, there's probably 2,000 to 3,000 birds just in this flock here. Just enormous numbers. There's a number of scientists saying that these birds are turning into urban foragers because we see them in our lawns occasionally and parks. But this is the habitat we need for these birds. If we get it right, this is where they're going to be foraging, because this is just incredible habitat for these birds. All right. Okay, so now we're going towards the end of the nesting season. Now we're into May. See, even when we had really wet conditions, you can see that much of the Everglades is still drying down relatively quickly. This is how quickly it can dry, even when we have huge amounts of water in the Everglades. And it's now at this point, our marl prairies are now dry. Our prairies up here are dry. There's not going to be any more foraging up here. It's just too dry for them. The good foraging is now in the sloughs. Sloughs here, this is the lower end of Lossman Slough. This is the lower end of Shark River Slough and Taylor Slough down here. And this is where the birds are foraging now. It's these sloughs are important, but it's not really until the very end of the nesting season that they become important. But if I was to compare this to a drier year, we wouldn't see, even with the same depths, we would not see the same amount of birds foraging, because we just simply didn't have enough prey production to support enough of a concentration of it. Okay, so let me have a quick check. Oh, we're at 8 o'clock already. Do we have time just to go through a few photos?
Sure. Carry on.
I can go very quickly. Oh, okay. So just very quickly though, just before I finish. So, what does this all mean in terms of Everglades restoration? This is a map of the Everglades. Our current restoration plan is really, this is one of the major areas where we're blocking water flowing here. This area here and this area here. And so the major goal of restoration is to open up some of this area, open up some of this area down here, and get water flowing into Taylor Slough and into Shark River Slough. But what we've shown with these colonies here and recovering these colonies, and the fact that the marl prairies over here are so important, is that we also need to be able to restore flow to this area here, and also to make sure that we have sufficient water in the conservation areas towards the end of the nesting season. There's, in recent year or two, there's been a huge call to make this area much shallower than it is, and I disagree. I think there are reasons for that. I don't disagree with all of it, but if we want to restore some of our wading birds, then we need to have at least long hydro periods, long periods where water remains in this region. Okay, so now we're going to go through just as many photos as I can in the next 5-10 minutes. So this is just a photo, in October, November 2021, a very wet landscape. Right, this is Florida Bay in the background. This area is Flamingo, if you're familiar with this. It's the southern tip of Everglades National Park. These are some of the lakes that we have, the coastal lakes. This is all mangroves. And this is Taylor Slough here. And so what we're going to do is we're going to sort of head down to this area now with the photos. And this first image, really what I was trying to do when I'm trying to tell a story with some of these photos is I want to both show how, it's all about getting water to flow back to the Everglades, into Florida Bay, into these coastal regions. And so, what I wanted to show was that flow. And so what we've never seen before is these kind of dendritic deltaic patterns of flow coming down here into Florida Bay. This is an area called Garfield Bight, just one of the bays in Florida Bay. It's a kind of low tide. And so you can see this sort of ribboning. You can actually see there's so much fresh water coming down that it's actually flowing into the bay. And it's this orange color because the water has passed through the region of mangroves, which makes it all orange. It's basically, these dead mangrove leaves are basically releasing tannins, just like tea leaves, and it's creating this beautiful orange color. But the nutrients coming down here in the fresh water is basically really stimulating the productivity of this bay area. All the little critters in the mud down here are going crazy because finally we've got the hydrologic conditions and the salinities we need to be able to, the lower salinities that really creates this production in an estuarine environment. So we get, the response, and we have these American avocets flying across this, this colorful sort of interesting pattern here. And actually this image now is actually in the final, is part of the finalists, fingers crossed, of Bird Photographer of the Year for this year's competition. And so here's another kind of image similar to that. This time there's a higher tide level in a slightly different region. Again, this one actually won highly commended in the Mangrove Photography Awards a few years back. And just, for those of you who aren't familiar with American avocets, I call this one the nonconformist. You've all seen shorebirds, they all face into the wind or away from the sun, depending. And there was just this one guy in the middle here just not following suit. So this one also won a commended award in Bird Photographer of the Year a few years back. It's not just the avocets, I like photographing the avocets. They seem to be there at the right place, but when we have these flows and this fresh water pulsing into Florida Bay, I was discussing with Deborah earlier here, snakebite, Lake Ingram, just literally hundreds of thousands of shorebirds and seabirds of all colors and shapes and sizes. If there's one bird that really shows the productivity of this area when we have these freshwater flows, it's the American white pelican. These are huge birds, 20 pounds, 9.5-foot wingspan. I estimated about 10,000 birds, pelicans were overwintering here along the bay in 2021. But to be able to support such a bird, you need huge amounts of fish. And just, look at these mangrove areas. Some of these are dead or recovering because of Hurricane Irma. It just, this just shows how much productivity can occur when we simply add fresh water. And here's just a sort of, this is kind of an ugly image. It's really just to demonstrate, it's more of a photograph, scientific photograph, but we can also get some nice artistic images of the patterns and balance that these white birds can create in the patterns and against the beautiful black background. Just wonderful textures and colors with these tannins and the blues of the water, and these lots of pelicans down here, and all these black dots are black skimmers and other seabirds. Black skimmers are rare. You don't see that many of them, but when we have these conditions, the bay supports thousands of them, just unbelievable numbers that I'd never seen before. And so this is just these birds, black skimmers in flight across the mud banks in snakebite near Flamingo. For those who are not aware what a black skimmer looks like, this guy. And by the way, most of these shots, most of them will be aerial images. I just wanted to show you the aerial images. This was a really nasty day, cloudy day. Just, it wasn't great for photography. But this streak of sunlight came through the clouds and just lit up these black skimmers. Another kind of ugly image in the recovering mangroves, but just look at the number of egrets, herons, and spoonbills and everything else that's foraging in this coastal mangrove environment when we have the water right. And if you think there's a lot of birds here, this is about 10%, no, probably about 5% of the size of that flock. It was enormous. And when we have those excellent foraging conditions, we have excellent nesting conditions. This is that Cabbage Bay colony again, slightly closer up version. And again, woodstocks, the young woodstocks, we can see they're young because of the excuse me, the orange bill. Just showing how well these birds did in these years. And when I'm flying over this area, I'm always looking for sort of beautiful textures and colors and arrangements of these of the birds and other animals in the environment. This is a flock of spoonbills simply flying over some interesting colors of algae growing with these tannic waters. And here's a similar one, but with a bluish algae and tannic waters. And this previous one, again, this is another one I actually got 4 in the finals of Bird Photographer of the Year award this year. And a lot of it isn't just because I'm a good photographer. I'm lucky because I have this unique opportunity to be able to capture these images that nobody else can. Spoonbills creating these sort of artistic patterns on the mudflats. This actually, I'm cheating. This was this year. This was actually a couple of weeks ago, of flamingos flying over an area just adjacent to Lake Ingram on Cape Sable, right at the southern tip of Everglades National Park. More flamingos. Now, this one's pretty interesting, really unusual. This is purple sulfur bacteria, creating these amazing pink coloration. These are photosynthetic bacteria, but they like saline, anoxic, no oxygen conditions. And it was just perfect conditions. We wiped out, this is an area that had been wiped out by the storm. But with the water coming through and these anoxic conditions, what happened is the area of water that's there, the fresh water goes to the surface, anoxic conditions underneath, and all the critters that live in the sediments have to come to the surface because there's no oxygen there. So, lots of different shorebirds. We had reddish egrets, all, ducks creating all these wonderful textures and trails, these teal doing this. They had very shallow water, feeding in just an inch or two of water. And so, there's just these wonderful opportunities to create these wonderful, unusual images. The lakes used to, the coastal lakes and bays of Florida Bay used to support hundreds of thousands of waterfowl. This is lesser scorp in one of the lakes. Actually, that was this year because we had very, very wet conditions. When you have all that fresh water, these lakes have turned saline over the years, but when we have all that fresh water, the vegetation returns, and that's what these birds are. They're either eating the vegetation or the critters that live in this vegetation, and that vegetation has disappeared largely, and it didn't come back in numbers until this year. And so again, finding interesting shapes that you can see all the vegetation here. This is a closer picture of those lesser scorp. And just, they were just showing the numbers of them. We estimated over 50,000 lesser scorps were in these lakes this year. Blue-winged teal creating wonderful patterns again and colors against that sort of tannins and algae. Patterns again by blue-winged teal. And when we have all these teal and waterfowl, we get predators. So there's a bald eagle nesting in a dead mangrove tree right on the coast. This is a bald eagle flying over, again, looking for shorebirds over the mudflats. Just, a different view of bald eagles from where you would normally see them foraging. Other predators, crocodiles in the mangrove region, more crocodiles. Cool critters such as sawfish. Occasionally, this was a big 9-foot sawfish that we saw. Dolphins come right up the rivers because when we have these really wet conditions, all the fish are moving into the headwater rivers, and so the dolphins come up. And they also, the dolphins in Florida Bay, they have this really unusual and rare foraging strategy called mud ringing, and they really only do this in a few areas. Florida Bay being one. I think there's a few places, Belize, and it's also being recorded somewhere up in North Florida, but it's pretty rare. And this is one of my favorite photos, not because it's the best in terms of composition, you're kind of constrained as what you can do, but to actually find these dolphins doing this and to get the fish jumping into the mouth at the same time is really rare. And so basically what's happening is one of the dolphins, this one, swims up here, flips, it's very shallow water. It flips up, the mud with its tail, creating this ring, and it entraps a shoal of mullet. Now the mullet do not like to swim through the mud. I don't know whether it affects their gills or whatever it is. And so instead, what they do is they don't like to be trapped, and so they'll jump out over it. And what happens is the rest of the pod of dolphins is waiting along the outside, and they have this uncanny ability to know where that fish is going to jump. And so this one, I was just really pleased to get it just as it's about to catch it. Now, this is a completely novel behavior. It's mud ringing again, but here we had two, and this had never been recorded scientifically. And it's two dolphins that have a slightly different approach. They again swim around and trap the fish, but they leave a little doorway for the fish to pass through, and they grab the fish as they're as they're trying to escape through this little hatch here. Lemon sharks over seagrass beds, mating nurse sharks in the shallows off the Gulf Coast of Everglades National Park. This one was actually runner-up. I'm really proud of this image. It was runner-up in the Mangrove Photography Awards last year. And the reason I'm so proud is because, you know, the Mangrove Photography Awards it's my favorite award because they do so much in terms of conservation. So this got noted in the BBC and the Guardian, and it was displayed at the COP climate change conference in Dubai, where they had 70,000 delegates. So, you know, really showing off the value of mangrove habitats to, you know, not just 70,000 people, but, you know, a huge number of dignitaries as well. So I was really happy with that. Manta rays. This is basically just showing what Florida Bay looks like as we're flying over it. How are we doing for time? Do you want me to make a stop now?
No, just we're enjoying it.
Okay, all right, I'll continue. This is snake bite. This is an area where we have those mud flats, and I took a lot of those images that I was showing you. Oops, yeah, carry on this way. Notice actually just, you know, the mangroves here, you know, it's very low nutrients in this region. These are mangroves. They're called dwarf mangroves, or now they call them shrub mangroves. Very low stature, just about 6 foot high. But as we move around, we're at Cape Sable, we're getting creeks, these mangroves are getting larger. We got more nutrients in this region because the Gulf of Mexico provides a lot of nutrients that are missing in the waters of the Everglades. So it kind of creates this fertilizer. This is Lake Ingram looking to the east, and just, you know, just beautiful textures and drainage patterns as it dries out. You can see the mangroves here. This area, by the way, is just phenomenal for shorebirds and for American crocodiles. Sometimes I see up to 50 American crocodiles at a go when I'm and flying over this area. As we go around the coast more, this is the end of Shark River Slough, one of the drainage channels coming out of Shark River Slough. You can see again the tannins coming out of this water, entering the Gulf of Mexico. A similar one here. We're looking northwest up the coast. Again, the same. And then finally, we're kind of heading towards the 10,000 islands and the end of the Everglades. So just quickly, so now we're in the freshwater Everglades. This is the Loxahatchee National Wildlife Refuge. There's so many tree islands in this area. This is actually a wading bird colony, a white ibis colony of about 15,000 nests. Here it is a bit closer up view. And this is the white ibis. White ibis, you know, we look at them, they can be shabby, kind of grubby looking, you know, not particularly beautiful, but just for a few weeks of the year, just before they start breeding, they show that they're in breeding conditions, and they have these beautiful carmine colors, the blue eyes, and they look really spectacular just for a few weeks of the year. And then numbers, as I, you know, showed with that video earlier, can be, you know, just incredible. This is what they're eating, the crayfish primarily, although they will eat other things if they can get hold of them. But this is really what triggers and drives their nesting, and in my view is one of the keystone species of the Everglades. The spoonbills that historically nested just on the coast, that's all they were found in Florida Bay, are now moving, like many other species, moving north. And so we've seen this over the last 10 years, this huge influx of roseate spoonbills into the freshwater Everglades, and their numbers now can be, you know, incredible. Historically, there were about 1,000, 1,200 nests in Florida Bay. We've got much lower numbers now because of climate change and water level rise. But in the freshwater Everglades, they're doing just fine. We've in some years we do get upwards of 1,000 nests. What I like taking pictures of most of all in the northern Everglades, for the most part, is the eagle nests. Ironically, I used to call this tree and the eagle nest within it the tree of life. But shortly after I did that, it was struck by lightning. And I called it a tree of life because, you know, the Pandora, movie, and it's just this huge pine tree in the middle of the Everglades that, you know, towers above the rest. But because of that towering and its exposure, it got struck by lightning. But nonetheless, it's just wonderful to take photos of during foggy conditions. Here's another one a few years later after it was, you know, after it's decayed a little bit, and you can just see the eagles there sitting in the boughs. And here's another wide angle version. Another eagle nest in the fog, this time in a cypress area, but just with, you know, everything else is muted apart from these, the top of the cypress dome that's above the fog. That's the same one. Alligators in the Everglades on the Big Cypress border. Alligators in Florida Bay, creating all these beautiful patterns with their trails. And that is it. Just a couple of summaries. Wading birds are resilient. We get the water right, they will come back, and almost immediately. But to have these nesting events, we require with these increased flows that hydrate these specific areas, those coastal habitats, the marl prairies, and also the ridge and slough at the end of the year. And you know, I didn't really go into this, but wading birds are, you know, very reflective of a healthy functioning ecosystem. If we get their umbrella species, if we get it right for the birds, the wading birds, we get it right for everything. And that's important because they play this huge ecological role. I don't really have time to go into that right now, but I've already gone over 20 minutes, so I'll call it a day at that. So if there's any questions, thank you.
Great.
fantastic.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Mark.
You are
All
very
right.
good. Shall I stop sharing?
Susan will read the questions.
Okay.
Yeah, can you talk about how the white ibises need a very secluded place to rest, contrary to being an urban bird?
Oh, no. What I was... Okay, carry on. Is that the end of the question? Sorry, I've jumped the gun.
Yeah, yeah, no,
Oh.
that's it.
Okay, so no, they have become somewhat urbanized. The point I was trying to make there is that they've really only become urbanized in the last 10, 20 years or so, as conditions elsewhere have become kind of poor. And regardless of the fact that we see birds foraging on our lawns and things like that, there's very few birds that actually nest in these there's very few ibis that nest in the urban environments. You know, maybe a couple of hundred in all of South Florida. And that's because to be able to nest successfully, these birds require the Everglades. They require these natural wetlands to be able to forage in and forage. You know, you've seen the huge numbers of foraging birds. White ibis are not a bird that does very well individually. They nest in these huge colonies. And I don't know if you've ever read anything about the passenger pigeons that, you know, we had billions of. It was the most abundant bird probably ever that the world has seen. And, you know, in North America, and we wiped them out basically within a decade. And it wasn't necessarily that we wiped everyone out. There were still millions of them, and they all of a sudden collapsed. And the reason is these birds function through communication. They nest in these big colonies, they forage in these large flocks, and they're always watching one another. They're learning from one another where they're foraging, where they're best nesting. And so these birds really require these large sort of flocks for informational purposes. And so what we really need for these birds to survive is to have those excellent conditions in the Everglades, because when we do, you know, that's how they can function and support themselves. In the urban areas, they're really feeding on terrible foods. They have very low health. They have high levels of diseases, and they just don't function very well.
And almost no one has seen the first fledglings, hatchlings of ibis that are black. That's a surprise to most people, right?
Mhm.
Right.
Because they're so secluded, we don't see them.
That's right. Yeah, actually, because I wanted to show more photos, and I actually had a photo of a black, one of the nestlings that had just hatched, and yes, they're black. They have a black down on them, and even when they first fledged the nest, they're a dark brown color, and you will see those fledgling birds in the urban areas on occasion. They're the darker brown colored birds. I have them in my yard every now and again. They stay that sort of brownish color on their wings, and then they gradually lose that over the year, over their first year, and by the end of their first year, they're largely white. So you will see those birds in the winter months, in your backyards, but not the black nestlings.
Mhm.
Now, Greg asked, it sounds like the prime underlying problem is the lack of consistent water from Okeechobee due to development and farming south of the lake. Who controls water flow levels through the lower Everglades? Is it Florida or federal?
It's mainly from the lake. It's mainly federal. Yeah, it's the Army Corps of Engineers. Now the issue though is getting clean water. The problem with it's not that we're really lacking water. You may have heard this year that there's so many complaints because we had so much water in the lake. It was far too high. And so what happens is when it's high, water is sent to the coast, east and west, the St. Lucie estuary and the Caloosahatchee estuary. And those areas do not want that pulse of fresh water. The Everglades does want that pulse of fresh water. The problem is the water is too full of nutrients. It's too dirty, basically. It's full of fertilizer through years of buildup at the bottom of Lake Okeechobee, and so even now, even though there are much better farming practices, the water that comes south is dirty. And so what happens, it has to go through those stormwater treatment areas. We have, I was stating before the presentation that we have 60,000 acres of stormwater treatment area that is used to filter and clean all that water. And they're natural. It basically uses plants to suck out all the phosphorus nutrients out of the water. And then we have low nutrient water, which is what the Everglades requires, flowing into the Everglades. But that is the bottleneck, unfortunately. It's impossible to clean enough of that water quick enough without damaging those stormwater treatment areas. So we're still somewhat constrained about how much water we can put from the lake into the Everglades. Now, hopefully a lot of that will be rectified with the new reservoir, huge reservoir and stormwater treatment area for that reservoir that's currently being built south of Lake Okeechobee. And that'll go a long way to helping that.
I heard years ago that there was a large band of cattails taking up those nutrients.
There is, yes. And so that's still the case. It's not it, but that's just in one region. And now we have much fresher water flowing into that area. But yeah, so there is a ban of cattail, but we still can't put dirty water into the Everglades any longer. And the whole idea, one of the reasons we produce those stormwater treatment areas is because we have all that cattail growing in the Everglades. So, I showed you that wonderful picture of the ridge and slough right at the beginning. Well, it wasn't necessarily a wonderful picture, but a picture of the ridge and slough. And basically what happens if you add, Here is a picture. Come on. Where are we? Here's a picture of the ridge and slope. So this is very low nutrient water. This is, and the landscape looks like this because it's low nutrient. This is a very sort of healthy region of the center of water conservation area 3A. We've got tree islands, we've got ridges and sloughs that are still in really good condition. But if you add nutrients to this fertilizer, cattails will outcompete the sawgrass, and basically it will cover this entire area with 14 to 15 foot cattail. The cattail dies. It creates this layer of dead vegetation over the water. So basically there's no photosynthesis going on in the water. There's no vegetation growing. And so the area basically becomes a monotypic cattail with nothing else growing. It's basically a dead wasteland. And it's simply because of nutrients. So to be able to have a functioning ecology and ecosystem, we need low nutrients in the water, and that will help maintain this kind of habitat. And of course, you know, birds can't forage in 10 to 15 feet of monotypic cattail, and there's nothing, and even if they could, there's nothing for them to feed on because there's, you know, there's no photosynthesis, there's no productivity, there's no fish. So that's why we clean the water.
Very good. Other comments, V. Santella, who is a wildlife photographer, not a scientist, said that your purple sulfur bacteria in water birds will place. He's confident. And then congratulations on catching that bottlenose dolphin, catching that mullet jumping out.
Yeah, that was luck.
And,
Thank you.
and that your mating nurse shark image was used for conservation awareness. He did say there was a title he thought might have been a flock of roseates, not American white pelicans. I don't remember that picture.
Oh, so yeah, maybe I thought I'd gone through all the slides, but yeah, that's a possibility because basically I copied one of the slides and just duplicated, and I thought I'd adjusted all their titles, but apologies if I missed one. Yes, it was an American pelican slide that I duplicated, so that makes sense.
And you said you were in the flamingo working group. Are there any techniques you've figured out to foster the flamingos so they stay in a place like Merrill Island where they started?
No, no, not yet. No, right now what we're doing now is trying to understand, given that we have quite a lot of flamingos in South Florida, where they're foraging. You know, what are the areas that are because even we know so little about the American flamingo as scientists. We have very little information on where they feed, what they forage on. You know, there are a few limited studies, but certainly none have been done in South Florida or Florida. You know, and these birds are primarily found today in Cuba, in northern Mexico, and the Bahamas. So, you know, those areas, by the way, have done a much better job of conserving them than we have, but there hasn't been a huge amount of science done. So that's right now, we're still in the early stages of trying to understand these birds. And so what we're doing is we're using a lot of the information, all the sightings on eBird. So if you ever see them, please put them on eBird because that's what we're using as our reference. And by knowing where they are and how they're moving around the state, we can get a better handle on what specific habitats are important for these birds. And then our next stage is, you know, once we know where they're foraging, is to sort of go in there and try and sample it a bit more and try and understand what they're eating. We've done that a little bit in the SDAs, and to be honest, we couldn't figure out what they were eating at all. But nonetheless, yeah. So we're kind of at the beginning in terms of the science and understanding what kind of conditions they need. But a large part of what we're doing now is just trying to educate the public. So one of the things we're doing is we're helping to run the state bird. We're advocating for the flamingo to be the state bird. And to be frank, we don't really care if the flamingo becomes the state bird or not, whether it's the scrub jay, which is equally, equally warrants that status rather than the mockingbird, or whatever species. But it does help provide a lot of publicity, and we want people to really start to know that the flamingo is a native species. It's one of the emblems of Florida. Culturally, financially. Oh my goodness, the amount of people we get on our tours when we do a flamingo tour to the SDAs, they come from all over the country to come and see them. So, it's a major attraction for Florida as a whole. And by the way, I meant to mention this earlier. If you're looking for people to give presentations, some of my colleagues at the Florida Flamingo Working Group can provide a wonderful overview of flamingos, how we know that they're native species, and an overview of what the Flamingo Working Group does. So, and two of they're great presenters. So, just let me know.
By any chance?
What's that? Sorry?
Is that Stephen Whitfield by any chance?
Yes, it is Stephen Whitfield and Jerry Lorenz as well.
Oh, and Jerry Lorenz. Okay.
Yes.
Yes, we've had Stephen Whitfield on this Bird Chat series, and it was an excellent talk.
Okay,
Yeah.
great.
Very excellent. Very excellent. All right. Lots of great congratulations. Great talk. Great job. Wonderful photos. And
Thank you.
Vicentillo said your Miss Shrouded Bald Eagle nest will be finalist for Bird Picture of the Year. Very excited. So,
Thank you, Vicky. Vicky's a great photographer as well.
wonderful. Well, thank you so much for everything. Any more questions?
All right, we'll let you go then. Thanks again.
All right. Freddie, thank you for joining us.
I appreciate the ability to spread the word about wading birds in the Everglades. So I thank you guys.
And a beautiful way to do it. Thank you for those pictures.
Thank you so much.
Nice.
Okay, guys, I'm going to go and get some dinner.
Okay.
All right.
Bye-bye.